I love scientists, and this is my best friend. His name is Dr. Bubba. He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and me and Bubba have been best friends since we were children. He was in Massachusetts getting his doctorate or something, and he invited me and my wife up for a weekend. He said, "Hey, man, we'll cook out, we'll have beers, it'll be great, we'll catch up." And Bubba's the type of friend that every man needs. He'll get you into just as much trouble as he'll get you out of. So he makes a great best friend. And after several beers and, having a good weekend, he said, "Hey, go with me to this bar. There's a guy there that I think you should meet. He's from the Mississippi Gulf Coast like us. He's really interesting, and he has a peg leg." And I thought, well, how can I turn down an offer like that? So this is Joe Davis. Joe's not a doctor, but he was a resident at MIT for 35 years and now is at the Harvard School of Biology. He is an incredible human. And when I met Joe, he said, "Can I see your ID?" He wanted to make sure I was from Mississippi, and he was also holding a 16-inch blown glass sperm. He immediately handed it to me after checking my ID and said, "Don't break this. I've worked on it all day." I said, "Thanks, Joe." And after a couple of more beers, as you do when you're from the coast, you talk about Katrina. This is my hometown, and this is actually where Joe grew up as well. We grew up a couple of blocks from each other. And Hurricane Katrina is a catalyst for conversation for people from the Gulf Coast. And Joe starts telling me about a tribute he's building to victims of Katrina. He explains that it's a laser that'll shoot into the ionosphere. It'll be visible for miles around, but it also can control weather. And I realized that Joe's not like me and Bubba. Joe says, "Do you want to see it?" And I say, "Of course, I want to see the fucking laser. Let's go look at it." And so he finishes his joint, and we dash into his broke-down Volvo. And we take off into the pouring rain in Harvard Square, and we enter Joe's brownstone to what can only be explained as a menagerie of experiments. There are butterflies, there are robots, there are everything that you would expect from a mad scientist. There are mitochondria that are in a petri dish that Joe has hooked a deep-sea fishing rig to. You strap in and you sort of fish them out of the mitochondria dish. That was hours of fun in itself. But when we get down to brass tacks, Joe starts explaining to me the things that he believes about science, and he tells me that when he was a kid, his father used to tell him that the human spirit didn't exist inside of people, that it existed on all the things that a person touched that they encountered. And he had proven this in an experiment with rocks, and the clouds that had passed over the rocks, you could track them for decades back, longer than decades, by seeing how they changed the chemicals inside the rocks, and that we had done the same things to the things around us. And that's when I realized that Joe really wasn't like me and Bubba, who had fallen asleep on the couch a few hours earlier. So what Joe explained to me was something he was working on called supercode. And, you didn't expect to have two biology talks back to back. We're going to explain supercode real quick. Essentially, you can encode binary data into the genetics of animals. That's what Joe had discovered. And if you know anything about DNA, it's ridiculously giant. A strand of DNA will wrap around the earth. A gram of DNA will store more than the entire written contents of human knowledge. So Joe figured out how to attach binary data about humans onto this and had started injecting it into E. coli. As the E. coli evolved, they rejected that code and started spitting it back out. So he started embedding it into the native DNA of E. coli. And of course, the next step, what do? You send it into space. So Joe writes a couple of poems, attaches it to the E. coli, and sends it up to the International Space Station on a Soyuz rocket, puts it into the pooper tank on the International Space Station. E. coli breeds like crazy in poop. And guess what? As it's expelled from the space station, it's slung around the Earth at light speed and then tossed out into the universe towards every alien life form that could possibly be cruising by. That's when I realized Joe really was onto something. And Joe was onto something on a level that I had never experienced before. Joe had a part of his brain that never said no. It never denied that little thing when you dream and you say, "Oh, that's not real," or "That can't be real," or "That can't be something that I could possibly do." Joe had a really weird cerebral cortex. And he had, in one evening, inspired me and Bubba as we walked out of his brownstone at the crack of dawn to think completely different about the way that we dreamed and about the way that we approached our lives. And I don't hear that voice as much anymore. Thank you.
This is